Julia Gillard is in Brussels on a crash course in foreign affairs, meeting 11 world leaders in one day at a summit of Asian and European leaders. Fresh from her visit to Australian troops in Afghanistan, she also met the Secretary-General of NATO to discuss a new strategic concept that could involve a deeper security relationship. I spoke with the Prime Minister by satellite from Brussels late today, our time. Julia Gillard, I'd like to start with Afghanistan. You said yesterday that Australian troops were making progress in Uruzgan province. How do you measure that progress? What are the definable benchmarks?
I think the best way of measuring that progress is how many soldiers we've trained from the Afghan National Army and how security is increasing. And the briefing to me was a very frank one about the security situation, and the reality is that it differs from place to place within Uruzgan province. But certainly some of the ground has been well secured. Security is being provided by Australians working alongside Afghan National Army soldiers. And of course the aim here is that we can transition the lead in security to the Afghan National Army. So Kerry, I'm not going to try and overput it. There are still places in Uruzgan province that are very dangerous, but security has been brought to part of the province, and obviously we are looking to expand that footprint of what is secure and where we can start to transition leadership to local forces.
But if, as you say, the Australians are doing so well, why have there been nearly as many deaths this year in Afghanistan of Australians as there have been for the previous 8 years?
There is a great deal of intensity in the fighting now. That is as a result of the strategy of surging. The current strategy is to surge, to have more forces there, obviously predominantly from the United States of America. But Kerry, we of course have increased our deployment there by around 40% in the last 12 months. Now, when you are taking the tempo up, obviously you make more progress, but there is also more danger, and we have seen that on display.
Do you accept the likelihood, as respected strategists believe, that NATO and Afghan government forces will not defeat the Taliban in Afghanistan, that the best you can ultimately hope for is to negotiate some form of shared government with the Taliban, an acceptable form of shared government with the Taliban?
When I was there, Kerry, I did explore this concept of what is called political reconciliation and also the concept of reintegration. There are really two levels to this. President Karzai and the international community are saying that if there are parts of the former Taliban that are prepared to lay down their arms to accept the existence of Afghanistan with a proper democratic governance structure, then obviously there should be dialogue on those questions. That's what President Karzai has said. Now, that, of course, is moving very, very slowly and is a very difficult process. Then there's the question of local reintegration. My own soldiers, our own soldiers, Australia's soldiers said to me when we were there in Afghanistan that there are local people who work with the Taliban not because they are motivated fighters, but because it's their best economic opportunity. They can get paid for doing things, and that means that they can feed their families. So the focus now is on reintegration, giving those people something else to do where they can earn money, feed their families, but no longer be collaborating with the Taliban.
Did General Petraeus explain to you how much of Afghanistan's south and east is already under a form of de facto government by the Taliban? Police, courts, tax collections, dispute resolution and so on, where locals actually look to the Taliban to provide law and order?
I think this is very geographic and place to place, but the advice to me in Uruzgan province where we are working is that there needs to be more effort in building of governance structures. For example, there is an acting governor in the province at the moment, and we have been pressing to see the appointment of a permanent governor. That is important to rebuilding leadership structures that are democratic government leadership structures. Obviously, there is the traditional tribal leadership structure as well. but really in many parts of Uruzgan province we are assisting in a process that is about having government there for the first time. Many of the people of Afghanistan have really never seen anything that looks like a functioning government, which is why you see such poverty and such illiteracy.
And when you spoke with President Karzai, did he acknowledge to you how endemic corruption is and how big a stumbling block corruption is to the kinds of goals that you and other foreign leaders have with the troops in Afghanistan?
I am well aware, the international community is well aware that corruption is a major issue in Afghanistan, and obviously the pressure that we have put on the nation of Afghanistan, on President Karzai, is to address these corruption issues.
And did President Karzai acknowledge that when you spoke with him?
I didn't have a direct discussion with President Karzai on that particular question, but we certainly had a direct discussion on the need to strengthen governance, particularly in Uruzgan province where we are working, the need to make sure that there are permanent appointments, not an acting governor, that is really a threshold step to building the kind of governance structures and government service delivery that we need to see functioning in Uruzgan province.
Does it concern you that since President Obama first spoke carefully, admittedly, about a conditional staged American withdrawal starting around July next year, that many Afghanis have translated that as the Americans are leaving, and that the Taliban have been encouraged to believe that they just have to wait you all out?
I am concerned, Kerry, that we need to be very clear about the message here, the message to our own community, to the Australian nation that, of course, wants to know exactly what is happening with our deployment in Afghanistan, and the message to the Taliban. And the message is this: security will transition over time to the leadership of the Afghan National Army when it's appropriate to do so. Transition will be a process. There will not be a transition day when forces like our own say, OK, the job is done, and start marching out of Afghanistan. Rather, it will be a process, even district by district, where an assessment will be made. Has sufficient been done on training and the bringing of security, that now the leadership of providing security can go to local forces? Even when that decision is made, there will need to be some overwatch capacity from nations like Australia working as part of the international forces there. And so, you know, the message to the Taliban, I know that the saying is being used in Afghanistan that Australians, Americans, the coalition forces there in Afghanistan are the people who have the watches, but it is the Taliban that has the time, and all they need to do is outweight the activities of nations like our own. I think we've got to be very clear. The message from us, from the coalition forces, from the world working together in Afghanistan, is that we are determined to see security there. We are determined to train the Afghan National Army. That is our mission. And when we work our way through that mission, then the Afghan National Army can take control of security properly in their own nation.
In Brussels, you've called for a deepening relationship between Australia and NATO. Afghanistan aside, why would that be of any strategic benefit for Australia, given that NATO's primary security focus is Europe?
Well, NATO itself is working through what it calls a strategic concept. In our language, Kerry, that would be the equivalent of a white paper. It's the kind of strategic stocktake you do periodically to guide the next period of your development. And NATO is conceptualising its mission in the world in which we live in today. Obviously, NATO is a product more of the Cold War era, and we are in a different environment. Our message, as NATO undergoes this process, is that we as a nation just want to be properly engaged when we have joint security interests, and particularly when we have deployed forces. So, for example, in Afghanistan, we have been very clear with NATO that we do not want to see decision-making about Afghanistan and the strategy there happen in NATO without Australian involvement. That's an example of the kind of engagement we seek to have. We're never going to be a member of NATO, we'll never want to be a member of NATO, but I imagine that in the decades to come there will be times, like now in Afghanistan, where we have shared security interests, where we'll want to work together and we'll want to get the structures of how we work together right, and that's the dialogue we're having as the strategic concept for NATO is developed.
This is your first overseas trip as Prime Minister. There must be something of a sharp learning curve in all this for you. All domestic portfolios until now. Suddenly you're meeting 11 world leaders in a day. Have you found your comfort zone yet?
Oh, look, Kerry, I'm obviously working my way through. Kerry, I'm just going to be really upfront about this. Foreign policy is not my passion. It's not what I've spent my life doing. I came into politics predominantly to make a difference to opportunity questions, particularly make a difference in education. So, yes, if I had a choice, I'd probably more be in a school watching kids learn to read in Australia than here in Brussels at international meetings. That's what took me into politics, that kind of education work. But obviously in this role I will serve as Prime Minister doing the full job. And the full job includes coming to places like Brussels to be a feisty advocate for Australia's national interest. And that's what I will do. It's what I'm doing here.
Julia Gillard, thanks for talking with us.
Thanks, Kerry.